Today I'm talking to Trevor Cowin, who is standing in the seat of Glenfaba and Peel. Good morning, Mr. Cowin.
Good morning.
Thanks for joining us. Now, you have been in the news over the years quite often, mostly because of petitions for redress of grievance, which you have presented, interestingly, on your birthday, on July the 5th at Tynwald Hill. So why, after all those years, have you suddenly decided it's an MHK's life for you?
Well, people have been asking me to stand for a number of years, mainly because of letters I write to the papers. I'm well known across the island for the letters that are produced or published in the papers. And I know people who only buy the paper to read my letters.
But it's a big difference from writing a letter to the newspaper than actually standing.
I got particularly annoyed last year when the president of Tynwald, Steve Roden, announced, I think it was in April, that because of the virus, petitioners couldn't submit their petitions on Tynwald Day by hand at the foot of Tynwald Hill, which is what's provided for in standing orders. The lockdown was then unlocked about 5 weeks before Tynwald, and I wrote to him and said, "Well, are you going to allow petitioners to comply with standing orders?" And he said, "No, the arrangements have already been made."
Yeah, if I could just interrupt that, as I understand it, there was a deadline given of the 1st of July because it was not known at that stage whether it was going to be a lockdown or not.
No, the lockdown had gone well before that. And anyway, they didn't change standing orders, and so I complied with the deadline, if you can put it that way. And I think I sent 8 petitions in, and within about 2 hours, the clerk of Tynwald replied and said they were all out of order. So I thought, well, the clerk at Tynwald can't decide whether they're out of order.
I've got a list of 1 or 2 of them here. Determination of validity of petitions. Correspondent with the deputy clerk at Tynwald about a 2020 petition. Yeah. Correspondent with clerk of Tynwald about 2020 petitions. They're all about a specific subject. Your petitions, are they not?
They're called petitions for redress, but you have to have a grievance to be seeking redress. So people call them petitions for redress of grievance. So you have to set out what your grievance is. And it used to be that you could have a grievance about anything. But they changed the rules after Tynwald 2020, after Tynwald 2020, that you have to have a personal grievance. But you can't just change and then they apply them retrospectively.
But there are other ways.
This is not lawful. This is not lawful.
There are things like public petitions, etc., can be presented and debated in Tynwald. Yes, is that not another way to go?
It is, but you've got to have a member of Tynwald to present the petition for you. And I haven't got any friends in Tynwald.
But you need them because someone has to pick up these petitions that you present on the hill. So what's the point of putting them out?
Well, I've had one petition picked up by Bill Shimmons, and it was about, I think it was about Geoffrey Boots' 20-metre rule for interested person status for planning. He picked it up and he put a motion to Tynwald that a select committee be formed to investigate my petition. And for the first time in living memory, they refused to appoint one.
But overall...
and I think it was only because it was me.
Overall, it's not a big hit rate, is it?
No.
The work you put into these things.
Oh, no.
So why do you do it?
Well, because I can do it, and I've got the time to do it, and I'm trying to hold the establishment, if you like, to account.
But this is the establishment, if you become an MHK, you're going to have to learn to work with.
Well, yes. No, they won't be there, because there'll be a new breed coming in this time.
Establishment, generally, establishment, you don't seem to get on with the establishment in the island.
No, I get on well with them, but they don't get on with me. There's a difference there, right? So,
but it's the same thing. You have to have a working agreement or working arrangement with these people.
Yeah. Anyway, for the first time in living memory, they didn't appoint a select committee, and I was told that just because it was you, that was all. They weren't prepared to do it. I mean, that's ridiculous. And anyway, life goes on, and I carry on submitting petitions. I think I put 13 in last Tynwald.
That sort of underlines the point that if you are standing for election, people might think that you're on one issue. Basically, you're pushing your own grievances.
Oh no! The grievances aren't generally they're not personal to me. I'm raising issues of accountability.
So do people come to you and say, could you please raise this for me?
No, they're usually issues that have cropped up in matters that I've raised with government. I'm minister.
So they are personal to you? They're things that you've seen?
No, not normally, no. But that's why they changed the rules. Because I had a number of issues in my petitions which were of a sort of general nature, not directly affecting me, which was quite in accordance with standing orders, but they didn't like it. So they brought a rule out, which isn't part of standing orders, to say that you have to have a personal grievance. And then they inserted this rule before the standing orders, which has never been approved by Tynwald.
If we just move slightly away from that, because you are obviously very determined in these things you do. You do it again and again. You want to try and get through. How do you see the role of an MHK?
Well, the role its primary role is overseeing what law is going through, and for that you need to have a good grounding in reading legislation and interpreting legislation. And I've done this for many years.
So you're a details man.
Yeah, exactly, and that's what Phil Gordon described me as once. Trevor is a details man, and I am. I look at it, all the detail. I mean, I've looked at the detail, for example, of two sets of regulations that were going to Tynwald to do with the Shees election. I looked at the first one. Hang on. They said the council ministers make these regulations under sections such as of these regulations. Well, sorry, you can't make regulations under the regulations you're making. You have to have a variant in the Act, a legal authority in the Act.
Ultra variance means outside their legal remit.
Yeah.
But is this stuff?
So they accepted that, and Ray Harmer had to put a correction note through to the president under it was the Legislation Act or something. I pointed out another one, which they quoted the wrong section of the Act, which meant that they were ultra various as well, and they gave up and just said, well, Tynwald approved it, so if you're not happy, present a petition of doleance.
This is very detailed stuff. Aren't people more interested in housing, in traffic, in that sort of thing, rather than the detail that you revel in?
Yes, I know, but I raised matters about all sorts of matters on my petitions.
So looking around Glenfaba and Peel, what do you think the matters that really are the ones that matter in that constituency?
In the constituency, remember, Glenfaba is a quite a large constituency. It stretches from Peel out to Neathshire, Kirkmichael, including
a conurbation and countryside, obviously.
And it covers St John's, Foxdale, Nearble, Dolby, and Patrick. And but the people I've spoken to many people in the constituency, and their main concern is the dumping of raw sewage off Peel breakwater. That is just dreadful. It's awful.
I mean, just quoting you did say in a quote about people walking through the sewage, including a dollop of human faeces. This is unattractive stuff. You think this is probably the major item that he's looking at?
Everybody I've spoken to says that is the major item which they want solving. We walked down onto the sands on Peel Day with my wife, and just to have a look back to see how many people were in Peel. It was packed, and we were faced with a slick of raw sewage and human faeces on the beach. But and children have been running through it.
Peel have been offered the opportunity of actually getting a works in there some years ago, and it came to nothing because the people didn't want it put where it was. Where do you think it should be put? And also the house outside Peel as well, which is...
I don't really mind where it goes, John, as long as it's built, right? The Glenfaba to me is an ideal site. It's been purchased. All the plans
This is on the road coming out towards Dorby.
It's a Glenfaba Bridge. Off Glenfaba Bridge. It was purchased. They knocked it down without planning permission. That's another issue. And before anybody knew, really, I think I was the last person to take a photograph of what was last standing.
It must have had planning permission to be knocked down. And you don't just knock down things.
No. They said they didn't need it.
Right.
Yeah. You remember the Town and Country Planning Act is an act for the protection of buildings. But the planner said, you don't need to knock down a single building. If it's attached to something, you do, but if it's a single building, you don't. I argued a long time over that one, and they wouldn't give in. They said, if you're not happy, take your own legal advice. Well, what can I gain out of taking my own legal advice, other than proving a point?
I think what you said and what most people would agree with, getting the sewage cleaned in Peel is a matter of urgency.
That is the primary matter that everybody is talking about in Peel. The beach is filthy. The people don't understand that when the sewage is dumped off the end of the breakwater, there's a back eddy which brings all that sewage back in through the bay. It doesn't matter which direction the tide is going. There's a back eddy, and it comes into the beach. It's in the sea and it's on the sand. And children are playing in it, and it's wrong. It has to stop. Well,
let's go to an associated issue, health, generally, care in the Isle of Man.
Yeah.
It's obviously a new body has been set up. What are your views on that?
Well, I think Manx Care appear to have been, they've made a good start.
In what way?
Well, they've decided to reduce waiting lists, which is essential, really. I mean, I'm on a waiting list for a new a spine operation and a new knee, but there's lots of people been waiting for years for.
There's a difference between decided to do something and actually doing it, isn't it? Do you think they will?
But they've made the first steps, and money's become made available to reduce the waiting lists. That's the first step. The disappointing thing is I asked some simple questions of Manx Care only a couple of days ago. I asked how many knee operations had been carried out in Nobles over the last 5 years, how many hip operations had been carried out over the last 5 years, how many of these operations had been carried out privately at Nobles, and if they knew how many operations had been carried out elsewhere. And I was advised to make a Freedom of Information request. Well, sorry, the Freedom of Information Act is so cumbersome and so rigid. I don't use it anymore. I just ask for information. Everybody is entitled to ask for information, and they should expect to get it. So I've reminded them of the provisions of the Code of Practice on Access to Government Information, under which you don't have to make a formal request. You just have to make a request.
What would you do if you became an MHK? How would you make your inquiries in that regard? Would you go and knock on doors, beat on doors, and say?
No, I would ask. And I would expect for the information to be provided. As an MHK, you don't have to put a Freedom of Information request. That's ridiculous. I would just ask, as I've been doing for the last year or so. I asked the Chief Minister for information recently, and he gave it to me. Quite a lot of information, right? I've asked ministers for information, and they gave it to me. I think the Treasury Minister is a bit slow, but I just ask for information, which everybody is entitled to ask for.
Let's move from care onto the home that was in Peel that was closed down, obviously.
Yeah.
What are your views that? Should it have been kept open? Should the government have stepped in?
Well, the problem with it was that I don't think there weren't enough residents in the home. This is
the Corrin home we're talking about.
Corrin home, yeah. The directors were aware that they couldn't keep the home going after, I think, the end of June, because the money would run out. And it was a limited company, and they couldn't trade in insolvency. So they had to close. There was no.
So they had no alternative?
They had no alternative, yeah. Except, that I think it was in March in Tynwald. Tynwald decided that they should approach the directors with their views of letting the residents stay there for another 6 months.
I suppose people say, should they have seen it coming?
Yeah, well, maybe, but Tynwald didn't put any money on the table when they said we'd like them to stay there for another 6 months.
Isn't it the government's job to see these things coming and deal with them?
Yeah.
Did they do that?
Well, I think they were talking to the home, but at the end of the day, it's an offence to trade in insolvency.
But would you argue for a new home in Peel?
Yes, it's an ideal. It's an ideal position.
Run privately or run by government?
I think it should be run by government. Yeah,
expensive.
And it would be. Well, government's got plenty of money in the bank. It's got 1.84 billion in the bank, according to the Treasury. And
so should we move on to the economy then? The Treasury Minister obviously says we have got this money in the bank. Are you confident about the island's future and stability, even in the face of COVID?
Well, yes. If you remember, I think they changed the law so that he could borrow a lot of money to pay for the pandemic. They only borrowed 40 million.
400, I think.
No, 40 million.
40 million, yeah.
They borrowed 40 million, and they paid it back after 3 months.
Right.
So they haven't got any debt now.
So you think the island's well placed?
I think the island is well placed.
So that's down to the government, the present government.
Well, I don't know whether that's it or not. It's whether it's it's not Alf Canada. It's not one person, but we've got 1.84 billion pounds in the bank. That's a lot of money. And we've got the National Insurance Fund as well. And although Alf, he said he borrowed 100 million from the National Insurance Fund at the start of the pandemic, I think the National Insurance Fund was there for this very purpose. If there was a downturn in the economy and people were claiming more benefits than normal, the National Insurance Fund was there to pick up the tab. And I think it was based on 12 months of benefits. Now, so I think there's been a fair usage of that. So he shouldn't have used the word borrowed. But if you remember, he borrowed money to build Noble's Hospital. But they didn't pay that back either. But again,
111 million, that was quite a lot of money in those days.
It was, yeah.
We'll just move on what the money is spent on. Looking out the window, the promenade scheme. Yeah. What is your view on how that... Well, you're smiling.
It's a complete disaster.
Yeah. But so whose fault is it?
Well, it's whoever is responsible in the DOI. And my concern is nobody has been held responsible.
It's the government's fault. It's not the firm that's building its government.
No, it's not the government. The government is all of the departments together, right? The DOI was responsible for the promenade scheme, right? And it's how long has it taken now? 2 years, 3 years?
Well, I think October is the next point.
When Tim Baker was when Ray Harmer jumped ship and went up to the Cabinet Office, the Cabinet Office as Minister for Policy and Reform, real non-job that one. Tim Baker took over, and I can distinctly remember him saying he'd brought forward the completion date to last March.
So what would you have done in his position? Because he seems being swept along by...
Well, he is being swept along, and that's the problem. It's the civil servants that sweep him along. But if you read the Beeman's report, I think it was page 11. I speed read these things. I got to page 11, I think it was. And
this is the report into the makeup of the Department of Infrastructure.
Yeah. They said that the DOI doesn't know how many civil engineers it employs, or whether they're properly accredited or otherwise qualified. I mean, that's a damning statement.
If I could just mention, you've mentioned one of the people who's also standing in Glenfaba and Peel, Mr. Harmer, but there are two sitting MHKs who are basically going for it again. What have they done wrong that you feel you could do better?
Well, they haven't sorted the sewage system out. They haven't sorted Peel Marina out, right? And we've got Peel Marina. They've now recently dredged it, but they're no different than all the ministers that went before them. There's never been a proper programme of dredging of Peel Marina, and they're all guilty of that. And I mean, they're not directly. I think Ray Harmer was he on DOI? I can't remember one time. I can't remember.
Ray Harmer was, yeah.
Yeah, he was. So he hasn't done anything about it.
Yeah.
Right. At the moment, they've spent. I think they've spent £9 million on the latest dredging operation. And they've dumped all that in a field adjacent to the power station. It's supposed to be a dewatering lagoon.
It's actually in a custom-made pit, isn't it, rather than dumped in a field?
It's called a dewatering lagoon.
Yeah. Okay.
But they haven't got any funding. They don't know where they're going to put it. They don't know where they're going to chip it, and they haven't got any funding to transport it to the
Just
chip.
move on to a couple of other subjects. Housing in Peel. Is there enough housing in Glenfaba and Peel? Should there be more?
I think there's been too many over the years. But there's an urgent need for a review of the finance arrangements the government has in place for first-time buyers. That needs to be reviewed, and need to extend the number of properties available for first-time buyers.
But you say there's been too much housing built already.
Yeah. Well, it would be okay if the infrastructure improvements had been made to go with it, but they haven't. None of the roads have been improved at all. Right? There's a shortage of doctors. There's a shortage of dentists. And the list goes on. School places.
Just move on to something else. Security in the island. The drugs problem seems to be growing. What's your view on that? Should we be harder on the border? Prison sentences, should they be harder?
Well, I read the papers, and very often the police are catching drugs offenders. Right? They can't catch them all, right? But maybe there should be a firmer presence at the borders. I mean, I think they got sniffer dogs. I'm sure they have.
Oh, they have.
Yeah, well, they should have sniffer dogs at every ship that comes in.
That's quite an expensive operation, isn't it?
So what?
But you think it's worth paying for it?
I think it is. Yeah. Well, do we want drugs on the island? Can you give me an answer? I don't think people don't want. Well, the drug users do, but the general public don't want a drug problem on the island.
What about cannabis then? Medicinal cannabis, which licences are being given when certain crises are crossed. Do you feel the island has rather missed the bus on that? Because some people feel we should have acted earlier.
Well, I think it's on its way, and I support the use of cannabis for medicinal purposes. Not for
recreational purposes.
No. But for medicinal purposes, I think it's been proven that.
So people who use it for recreational purposes, should they be given lengthy prison sentence?
Well, they should be, yeah. And I think maybe they should be given a minimum sentence, right? Not just a maximum sentence. There should be a minimum sentence, say, of 5 years.
So they shouldn't come out halfway through the sentence if they're well behaved.
And you have to serve whatever the minimum sentence is.
The prison authorities would say people get discouraged and a bit harder to handle if they know that they've got this lengthy sentence ahead of them, and it's easier if they know that if they behave themselves halfway through the sentence they'll come out.
But the minimum of, right? But if they have to serve that, and I think that would be a deterrent.
Interesting. We're coming to the end of this interview,
Yeah.
which has gone very quickly. You'll be knocking on doors, presumably talking to people. Is that the way you
no,
plan to approach this?
Because of the pandemic, I think it's irresponsible to be walking around and knocking on people's doors and speaking to people. So I've taken the view that my manifesto will be distributed by post to every property shortly before the election.
A shortage just before or what? When?
Well, I've been advised to leave it late. Because people throw them in the bin.
Or the day before, or what?
Well, about a week before.
A week before. People
Yeah.
can expect your manifesto
Yes.
to come through their
Yeah.
letterboxes.
Yeah.
Mr. Cowin, thank you very much for coming. Trevor Cowin, who's standing in the constituency of Glenfaba and Peel on the 23rd of September.